Thanks so much. Our guest and keynote speaker for today is Dr. Glen Fairen. And as we were just discussing, he's teaching at the University of Texas, El Paso in Religious Studies Department. He received his PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Alberta in 2015. And he taught the wildly popular Studies in Witchcraft in the Occult class, which I've come to understand was a bit of a sensation on campus. He's the author of As Below, So Above, Apocalypticism, Gnosticism, and the Scribes of Qumran and Nag Hammadi. And if Twitter is to be believed, he is the owner of an adorable black cat. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Fairen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Unfortunately, I do not have the black cat. He passed away last year at the ripe old age of 20. For an inbred farm cat, he did very well, better than anybody would have expected. So I have a slideshow, and I'm not sure if I'm able, host has disabled screen sharing. I don't know if that's something.
I've fixed that now. You're good.
Oh, okay. Let's see if I can get this to work. Can everybody see it?
Oh. Not yet.
No, all right. My apologies. I'm kind of new at the at this element. Let's see if I did something wrong. It's a pretty good guess that if something went wrong, it was me who did it. Okay, in Zoom, click share screen, select the PowerPoint window, then click share.
This is how we know you've got some Canadian in you, because you're already apologizing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I was told by an ex that I am the prototypical Canadian. I'm not sure if that was a good thing or not. She was from Texas, so maybe it wasn't the best compliment she could give.
Blame Canada.
Yeah. Let's see, new share.
Looks like that worked.
From your screen, PowerPoint, click slideshow tab from the beginning. Your current slide.
We've got part of it.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, there's a section of it, a sliver of it.
Oh, don't see it myself. I'm sorry, I didn't. Where am I? Oh, did it disappear?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's try it again. Share. Oh, there it is, down at the bottom. I see it. Can you see it now?
Not completely. We've got what looks like to be the top. There we go. Yep, we're good.
Okay. This is, I'm not sure how to go back on the slide, but we'll just leave it as it is for the moment. So, all right. So I guess I can begin. So of course, I would like to thank you all for having me come speak to you. This is actually an absolute honor to be here, even if it is only in virtual form. Now, the topic for my talk was initially envisioned simply to be the meaning of the occult. But if I've learned anything during the last 12 months or so, is that one has to be willing to adapt. That what seems like a stable or goes without saying experience a few short months ago, going to cafes or restaurants, face-to-face lectures, or actually having an active social life is not what we have to deal with today as what is now part of our new normal. And this has, of course, got me thinking about the topic of the occult. So while I initially envisioned discussing so-called occult trends, and ideas in the early modern world, it has occurred to me that given the change around us and how we've had to rethink simple activities like, do I wear a mask when I go outside? Can I actually share an elevator with this person? That we also have to think about the notion of the occult and how we revamp our classification for it. So hence the title of my presentation is What is the Occult? Meaning, Method, and Migraines. Meaning in that what constitutes the occult is not clear-cut as one would think. Method, because scholars have generally been haphazard, to say the least, when it comes to what they mean when they speak about the occult. And migraines because of the headache one gets when trying to pin down any sort of reasonable boundaries of what we are and what we have been talking about in the first place. Now, before I go into the paper itself, I just want to share a couple of brief stories with you. Way back in the dark ages, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I have a very clear memory of sitting in the doctor's office with my physician and my mother. And we, and by we, I mean them, I clearly wasn't paying attention, were discussing what I believe was my upcoming tonsillectomy. And what I remember about this moment was not the fear of having my tonsils removed or the promise of ice cream that I would have after the surgery, or even if I was the bestest boy ever, I would get my grubby hands on the newest Star Wars toy. What I actually remember was both the doctor and my mother were in the examination room with me, and they were both smoking. Can you imagine sitting in a doctor's office with your physician and your mother smoking? This is utter insanity. Now, the second story I wish to share with you is much more contemporary. Only a few years ago, I was on a blind date with a very nice lady. It seemed we had a lot in common, at least on paper. But of course, we started talking about what we did for a living, yada, yada, yada. And the fact that I teach religious studies at a university, of course, came up. Now, one of the things I've noticed is that when this ever comes up, be it on an airplane, at a party or what have you, you usually get people really wanting to engage, and sort of a way to kind of fend that off. I always say something like, I study dead people nobody's ever heard about, and hopefully they'll leave me alone. However, my date, I want to, be more friendly than usual. So she looked at me and said, well, that's very interesting, but do you know anything about the Mormons? And of course, I said, yeah, I've always had this soft spot for the Latter-day Saints. And she looked at me very seriously and said, they're a cult, right? And I said, oh, how so? And I think this probably was my first of many mistakes. She then proceeded to tell me that according to her church, and I want to say it was a Catholic church, but I honestly don't recall, that the Mormons were considered a cult as opposed to her own tradition, which was a proper church group. She proceeded to point out that they were a cult because of all the nefarious occultism things or occultish things that were going on behind closed doors, hidden meetings, abuse of members, secret rites, the litany went on and on. And of course, I was unaware of this minefield that I was wading into. So I took off I'm on a date and want to make a good impression hat and put on I teach religious studies hat, which again was a large mistake. I pointed out, I don't know, something to the effect that many mainstream traditions that we could think about, hers, for example, also have histories of doing the same kinds of things that she accused the various members of the Mormons of doing. And I continue to say something that a cult or church or what is an occult ritual versus something that is a sacrament is really just a matter of preference, something that as an academic, I try to keep in mind. And generally from my experience is that if one likes a group or belongs to it, then it tends to be a church that does normal things. Where if one doesn't like a group, say the Mormons, or has an issue with them, then they tend to be classified as a cult and do occultish kind of practices. Now, needless to say, there was no second date. It went horribly, horribly wrong after that, or actually went horribly wrong at the beginning of that, I should say. Now, this is not simply just to illustrate how weird and boring my life actually is, but both of these examples had me thinking about a lot of the things we do that were perfectly acceptable in one context has changed over time, like smoking in a doctor's office, how that has shifted from I refuse to say how long ago it was, to the current period of 2021. And that regardless also of claiming a fact of a tradition being true, such as the Mormons being a cult versus a perfectly acceptable church, that the perspective of the classifier, the person who is making these claims, matters as much, if not more, than the object that is being classified. And I think this is particularly true when it comes to the idea of what the occult means, or what it has meant in the modern world, both generally and in scholarship. Now, what is thought to be a cult, or any of these sort of other terms that relates to it, is actually a moving target. It changes depending on our time, our place, and perhaps more importantly, the perspective of the person making these claims. Now, of course, this isn't a big deal in the quote unquote real world. Outside of any critical study or model, nailing down a definitive definition of something really doesn't matter all that much. So the fact that the occult has a very fluid definition is not all that concerning. It is one of these commonsensical terms that most people you talk to carry with them, gives them some kind of idea or inkling of what the occult is or isn't, beyond what an academic might try to say. And this is also true for many of the other sort of related terms around notions of the occult, the esoteric, mystical, spiritual. These terms get used in very similar commonsensical ways. So for example, I'm sure most of us have heard somebody claiming, or perhaps you claim yourself, to be spiritual but not religious. That actually came up during another date, and that went with a different person. That went horribly wrong as well. I have a very bad, I should never go out on dates. But the question is, what does that mean when somebody makes the claim that they are spiritual but not religious? What is it they are actually telling us? Now, from a commonsensical and everyday kind of idea, this isn't an issue. But when it comes down to folks in an academic sphere, or people who are interested in these kinds of ideas in a more critical fashion, there does need to be certain boundaries. Or something to consider is when one or two different folks claim that they are both spiritual but not religious, or that they are interested in so-called occult practices, are they necessarily referring to the same kinds of things? Now, of course, they might recognize each other as belonging to a similar type. One might be into tarot cards, one might believe in guardian angels or past lives. And there does seem to be this mutual recognition that they share some common connection, that they might be there might be some kind of family resemblance as per the Wittgenstein model. They don't necessarily have to share all the same ideas, but there's enough overlap that they see each other of the similar type. But in a critical way, or in a way that I hope to do my work, and what actually does cause me migraines anyway, is the fact that from an academic perspective, we do not necessarily, when two people say that they're spiritual but not religious, there's a good chance that we are not talking about the same class of objects, beliefs, or even ideas. And if that is the case, then how do folks like scholars, academics, or folks like us who might be just interested in these kinds of ideas, how do they define it and think about it and, hopefully write about it? Now, again, the fluidity of meaning of the occult and or related terms is perfectly fine and good when it comes to the average person, perhaps expressing their views or their religious convictions or even lack thereof. But when unmodified, these kinds of terms, occult, occultism, spiritual, or even the term religion itself, are really not that helpful in trying to explain something in any way that could help us understand the phenomenon. Indeed, it seems to me anyway that these kinds of fluid classifications, while perfectly fine in everyday discourse, when used in an academic paper or research, they do more to mystify the object than they actually do to explain it, which can cause all kinds of problems. One of my favorite examples is, why is it that Jesus does miracles where Simon the magician does magic? To me, the classification of those is not about what is happening in the text, for instance, but what is sort of the agenda of the person making these claims. Now, there are, of course, a few scholars who have done some pretty good work on this notion of the occult, and one of them is the gentleman on the screen, Marcello Teruzzi. He passed away in 2003. He was a professor of sociology at Eastern, and he did his research in what sounds like the best discipline ever, proto-science and pseudoscience and claims of the supernatural. Now, in Teruzzi's work, he talks about the occult having a variety of definitions, both in popular usage, but also in scholarship. And what are the things that he talks about? Well, for him, he says occult comes from the Latin occultus, which means hidden or secret. And while normally the root of a word, as it was in an ancient language, has very little to do with its modern definition, I don't know how many times students start papers by pointing out that the word religion derives from the Latin religio, which means to bind or to tie together, and then go through this mental gymnastics to make it all make sense. For Teruzzi, though, the term occultus actually does play into his definition. For him, the occult is, one, something beyond the range of ordinary knowledge, that is mysterious. Two, it is secret, disclosed or communicated only to the initiated. Or three, of or pertaining to magic, astrology, or other alleged sciences claiming use of knowledge of secret, mysterious, or the supernatural. Now, of course, these are pretty common tropes when it comes up to scholarship around the notion of the occult. But what Teruzzi does is he adds his own spin and argues that the common denominator to all of these definitions or objects that get classed as occult is this idea of anomaly, something that goes against the generally accepted cultural storehouse of truth, either from an institutional level or from a commonsensical level. Now, this is, of course, a very contextualized definition of the occult. Given that a culture's knowledge changes over time, and that knowledge, and then as knowledge changes, so too does the stuff that is therefore considered anomalous shift as well. Now, if you recall the story at the beginning of my mother and the doctor in the office, smoking in front of me, this would have been considered so problematic now, but back then it wasn't that big of a deal. If somebody went to them, say back in the 1930s, however old I am, and said, you know what, that's incredibly dangerous, you're going to kill your child if you do that, they might have dismissed it. Oh, yeah, it's over exaggerating, that is a bit beyond the pale. Could you imagine if that happened now? Our understanding that smoking causes problems has changed. Our storehouse of knowledge has certainly shifted. It has gone from being not something all that problematic to something classified as harmful or abusive, depending on your point of view. Or if you're thinking of terms of the of Teruzzi, that going against this storehouse of knowledge, this idea that you shouldn't smoke in front of your children, could be seen as occult in some ways. Now, perhaps a more relevant example that I could give is how the understanding of medicine has changed over time, especially in the ancient world. Medicine was considered an occult, science in particular. One of the famous examples of this understanding was a figure named Galen. He is one of the most important doctors of the ancient world, though I would never let somebody with his knowledge come near me with a 10-foot pole. Nonetheless, he argued that medicine worked through some unknown properties or powers that people couldn't observe, and that these medicines did things that therefore people wouldn't expect, like cure illness. Nowadays, medicine is not occult because we know how it works. And even if we don't know how it works, for certain, we at least can know or go to somebody who probably does and can explain it to us in detail, a doctor, a chemist, a pharmacist, or what have you. So what this means to me anyway is that the occult can include a whole whack of different stuff depending on the context, and sort of where you happen to place it is where we can talk about these things in any meaningful way. Now, according to Teruzzi, when the occult is there are usually two kinds of anomaly involved. Something can be an anomalous object or can be an anomalous process. Now, anomalous objects are things that we do not expect to exist. Things like the abominable snowman, the Loch Ness monster, a compassionate Alberta conservative, these kinds of things. Ancient aliens perhaps comes to mind. Now, anomalous process are ordinary things or events that are placed in some sort of extraordinary circumstances. And Teruzzi argues that these are far more prevalent when it comes to so-called occult practices. So things like putting a pin into a voodoo doll in the hope of causing some harm to somebody. Neither pins nor dolls are inherently odd. Not like aliens or a Bigfoot or something to that effect. But if you think that their effects, if you combine them in such a way to cause harm, that could be considered quite extraordinary and goes against storehouses of knowledge, institutional or commonsensical. Or the idea that planets are aligned when you are born will somehow determine your personality in the future. Planets align all the time in various ways. People are born and have various personalities, but it is rather extraordinary to assume a connection in some way, shape, or form. Now, another element that is common when it comes to the study of the occult and is put forward by Teruzzi is this idea of secrecy. This was both a major anxiety and a so-called proof for that blind date I had in her definition of the occultist nature of the Mormons, the nefarious doings that they were doing in their short-sleeve white shirts in the dark of night. Now, of course, in a lot of societies, rituals or events that are private, that is secret or open only to the direct participants, are often seen as quite suspicious and are seen as somehow dangerous. One of the best examples, of course, is the accusations leveled against the so-called witches in the medieval and early modern period. That they were in the process of making a pact with Satan, were engaged in a variety of secret rituals. They were meeting at night when everybody else was in bed. They were doing things under the cloak of darkness that they didn't want other people to know about, and that these witches were claimed, or I should say, what these witches claimed to be doing really gives us an interesting sense of the anxieties of the people who wanted to classify them as other dangerous occult in some way, shape, or form. Now, here is a short little bit from the Malleus Maleficarum. It is one of the most interesting texts that I've encountered. I'll just give it a quick read through. And what is then to be thought of those witches who sometimes collect male organs in great number as many as 20 or 30 members together and put them in a bird's nest or shut them up in a box, where they move themselves by living members and eat oats and corn, as has been seen by many and is a matter of common report. For a certain man tells that when he had lost his member, he approached a known witch to ask her to restore it to him. She told the afflicted man to climb a certain tree, that he might take whichever member he liked out of the nest, in which there were several. And when he tried to take a big one, the witch said, "You must not take that one," adding, "because it belonged to a parish priest." Now you can kind of see the anxieties going on in the people making the claim. Obviously, the Malleus Maleficarum was written by a priest, otherwise you wouldn't have that tail end. But the idea that the sort of oddness of these things are usually cast in the light of people's anxieties. And I have to admit, ever since I've read this section of text, I have yet to be able to eat oatmeal. The idea just incredibly freaks me out. It is one of the few things my students remember in their exams when I put as a definition, why is oatmeal significant? This always is something they remember. Now, another example, of course, is the accusations that we see leveled against politicians who are seen as conducting shenanigans, behind closed doors, making secret deals, or that unelected officials, perhaps secret organizations, are up to no good. And this can range from the We Charity scandal, in which families of the government of Canada gain some sort of financial benefit behind the scenes, all the way to something like Pizzagate or QAnon, where the fear that the world is controlled by a satanic cabal of Satan worship pedophiles, or if you're Taylor Green, cable, as she always says. Now, Teruzzi also points out that the current in a lot of so-called occult circles is that teachings or information should be guarded from non-members. Only those who have been initiated can actually have access to it. And this is certainly true for a number of groups. However, one of the things I have encountered in my own research is that of groups that are considered occult, is that while a lot of groups claim to have some sort of link to this idea of the occult, and modern scholars perpetuate that, they put a lot of emphasis on this element of secrecy, a lot of the groups or individuals are really not engaged in anything all that secret, whether intentionally or not. Many of these ideas are quite open and quite accessible to the public. For example, if you think about the availability of things that at different times and places would have been thought of as occult, horoscopes, for instance, or the readiness of some folks to talk about and discuss astrology. This is hardly something that is kept secret. But more specifically and closer to the modern period, occult groups like the Fraternity of the Rose Cross, the so-called Freemasons, I shouldn't say so-called, the Freemasons, or even somebody like Aleister Crowley. Well, there is this fictive element that what they are doing is so-called secret, with a lot of emphasis that what they are doing needs to remain within the group itself. When you get down to it, this is generally not the case. Even before the rise of the internet, all the material of these groups was quite easily accessible. In other words, despite claims by scholars and insiders, finding out the rituals of the Freemasons, or what Crowley meant when he said true will or thelema, was not all that difficult. Indeed, perhaps the Platonic ideal of a modern occult group, that being the Theosophical Society and the figure of Helena Blavatsky, at no point were they ever secret in their ideology. They were actually active promoters in their own agendas. Hell, I was at Chapters last week and I found a copy of Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine. I think one was in the bargain bin. I should have picked it up. So there is, I guess, in reality, nothing secret going on with a lot of so-called occult groups. And despite the sort of emphasis on that, this gets me thinking that there's something else happening, that there's some sort of definition or mechanism that is going on that needs to be accounted for, and more than simply just that our commonsensical definitions assume. Now, at least with my example, what was thought to be occult, of course, carries with it a very negative stigma, something that is certainly comes up during my blind date, of course, but it tends to be seen as something as other. Occult has generally been seen as almost a wastebasket term that we use to put things that don't fit into established categories, such as religion or science. And here again is a quote from Teruzzi. In many ways, the occult is a residual category, a wastebasket for knowledge claims that are deviant in some way, that do not fit the established claims of science and religion. And once such a claim gains acceptance within the established science or religion, it loses its status of occultism. So this idea that what was occult in one period can change depending on the point of view. An interesting example that comes up in the case of religion is up until around the 1950s, shamanism was seen as superstition in some way. Then all of a sudden it switched and it became a world religion. It is something that shows up in textbooks. The actual objects never changed, but the way people thought about it radically shifted given more acceptance in indigenous cultures and what have you. So you do see this interesting phenomena. Now, in scholarship, there has been a bit of a shift in terms of this notion of occult, or what Teruzzi would have called occult. And this is essentially based around terminology. Nowadays, if you want to study some of the things that Teruzzi would have called occult, you're going to likely notice, at least in the scholarly circles anyway, that these have been rebranded now as esoteric. Occult doesn't carry the same sort of traction as something like esoteric does for a lot of people. And I find this part really fascinating, less so much from an insider's perspective, somebody who practices something, and more from the scholars who go through this mental contortions to try to make what they're doing less about the study of occult and more about the study of esoteric. Because it's not what we study that has changed, or that there's been a huge glut of primary data that has come forward, but it appears to be about the legitimacy of the scholar doing the research. And this is something that I find incredibly interesting. Scholars have been rather sheepish in claiming that what they study is the occult. And the reason for this seems to me to be the stigma associated with it. One of the funny things I get is when I'm on campus, students call me the witch doctor because I do the witchcraft class. I thought that was great. I love that nickname. But a colleague, one of the higher ups, actually found that quite problematic. They did not want me to sort of embrace this nickname because it made what we do look less than serious, especially in a program or in a university where, you know, it's all based around science and engineering. You have your popular class being taught by the guy who likes to be called the witch doctor. It tends to undercut the legitimacy in some way, shape, or form. Esoteric, on the other hand, is more respectable. It's one that denotes something a little more highbrow, perhaps more elite, and a little more sophisticated, where the occult has a bit of a negative stigma. It's, you know, hackneyed, it's lowbrow, or perhaps even dangerous. In my witchcraft class, we have a section called Nazi Occult Conspiracies, but it somehow loses this punch if I call it National Socialist Esoteric Theories. Especially to undergrads who may not know that National Socialism is Nazism, you get this, oh, that doesn't sound so bad. It's this branding that I find incredibly interesting. Now, of course, the term esoteric does derive from the Greek in origin, esoterikos, and in the ancient Greek text, it is used to refer to teachings that were secret, of course, but also carries with it a sense that the stuff was reserved for select or an elite audience. And this is a claim made by the medieval alchemists and astrologers of the Middle Ages. They didn't want to be lumped together with sort of the hedge magicians, the charlatans, the occultists of their time, because, you know, even though both groups were doing stuff behind the scenes, as an astrologer, I do something more prestigious. Sure, I'm not going to show you what I'm doing, but if you had that knowledge, you could cause harm. Where those magicians, on the other hand, they're doing similar stuff. It's just that there's a problem with it, okay? So there is this interesting shift in perspective. And while some scholars do use the term occult and esoteric as basically meaning the same thing, a lot of the more recent scholarship in what appears to be more about them as opposed to the group that they're studying, are using the term esoteric as a means of denoting something other than simply the occult, one that carries with it the implications of secrecy, but also of implying this element of elitism, that people that they're studying were doing something impressive, but also the seriousness of the scholars themselves, that they were doing something that shouldn't be dismissed as well. There was a chair, I think it was at University of Ottawa a number of years ago, on which studies of witchcraft and magic. So of course I applied, didn't get it, obviously. But the idea, I remember seeing media reports about how can a university do this? What lunacy is this? This idea that only this sort of fictitious or silly or superficial element can actually be studied in a serious way. And a good example of this is a book by a gentleman named, I'll never get his first name right, but his last name is von Struckrad. It's Western Esotericism, A Brief History in Secret Knowledge. And he goes on to say, whenever I talk about esotericism, I conceive of the esoteric much more as an element of discourse in the European history of religion. So he's tying these two things together. He wants to shoehorn his object of study onto the prestige of what it is to be religious. Anyway, the element of discourse can be identified as follows. The pivotal point of all esoteric traditions are claims to real or absolute knowledge and the means of making that knowledge available. This might be through an individual ascent or through an initiatory event, such as in secret societies of the modern period, or through communication with spiritual beings, as in the channeling of the 20th century. So here's this example of something really interesting, I think, going on with scholarship. He is offering this alternative to the occult, but claiming, by claiming that it does all the same stuff, but he rebrands it as something esoteric. And again, he makes it clear that it is, you know, goes against storehouse of knowledge, that it goes against sort of the commonsensical understanding. But again, esoteric has a slightly better shine to it. So Teruzzi and von Struckrad are really talking about the same things. Now, of course, there's some differences between the various bits of turf that these guys are staking out. Von Struckrad seems more interested in looking at systems of discourse. So he's more interested in institutions, for instance, as opposed to smaller scale things. And so he puts more emphasis on that. Teruzzi, he does think in those terms, or did think in those terms as well, but he also is more interested in these sort of smaller scale, sporadic things like the Loch Ness Monster and what have you. Now, which means to me that both Teruzzi and von Struckrad are quite capable of clumping a lot of disparate things together to come up with their own definitions. Now, why am I talking about this? Not just to hear the sound of my own voice. Well, this brings me back to that blind date I talked about. At no point in that conversation could the person I was having dinner with make any clear distinction between what was a cult and what was a church, or perhaps something that was positive, spiritual, esoteric versus this negative thing that she perceived was out there. It was all a matter of perspective. However, one of the few helpful bits that comes out of all of this, the scholars, my GP, the one and only date, is that in all these examples, there is this common element that something needs to be running counter to the shared institutional or common sense knowledge. And I should point out that this institutional or commonsensical knowledge doesn't have to be correct or factual in any way, shape, or form. The smoking in the doctor's office, for instance, part of the institutional and commonsensical knowledge was it wasn't that big of a deal. I can remember smoking or people smoking in airplanes, which when you think about it, that sounds, can you imagine somebody lighting up a cigarette in an airplane today? Or even the teachings of, say, the Roman Catholic Church or a more established Christian group. They are not any more factual or correct, say, from the Mormons, given a certain point of view, especially somebody like myself who does approach these things from a very atheistic and skeptical position. Though I will say anything with a demiurgical figure like Marcion or the Apocryphon of John, I'm all over that. That is by far the more interesting stuff. But that also goes for those groups that traditionally understood to be occult, such as the Freemasons, magical orders, the Theosophical Society, and what have you. At the time of their inception, well, many of these ideas of these groups might have promoted would have been, from a certain point of view, seen as occult, as per the negative, to the adherents of those groups, to the people who held to these ideas, and to folks in general. I would argue that the negative stigma certainly was not there. It was not this clear binary between good, bad, church cults, esoteric versus the occult. It was a little more blurry with what was going on. And especially when you consider the religious and spiritual landscape that was happening in Europe and North America during the early modern period. So for around the 1800s up into the end of World War II, a lot of the social context was certainly changing. And as such, the storehouse of knowledge was also being contested. So for instance, when we see the rise of these kinds of movements, it also coincides with massive social change. For example, we have the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution with the introduction of a whole new set of technologies that changed how people lived. This is also a period where mainstream religion or traditions were getting a major blow in terms of its influence and popularity. A lot of the more established groups, Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, what have you, were losing members to the charismatic tent preachers that flourished during what was known as the Second Great Revival. We also have Charles Darwin and what he wrote about when it came to evolution. This unintentionally challenged the biblical narrative, the creation account that you'd have in Genesis that most people almost assumed without any sort of thought. It was a goes without saying. And also people were becoming more aware of other traditions from areas that the Europeans and North Americans were colonizing. The indigenous folks of the New World, also India, Asia, etc. These ideas were now starting to come into the presence of the colonizers. So this understanding was there was a lot of other religions out there, which brought into question the institutional and commonsensical knowledge that Christianity was the only real option. All of a sudden, we have this glut of other traditions that look remarkably similar to what Christians were promoting at that time. So there was this sort of shift happening. And then, of course, there's greater levels of immigration going on. So folks coming into Europe and North America, practicing different traditions or different versions of an established tradition. In the United States, this was near the aftermath of the American Civil War, where there was, of course, major economic ramifications, especially in the South, not to mention with the various deaths and injuries that were still experienced. People would see soldiers who had lost limbs. These kinds of, the scars of war were still there. And the massive cultural change with the abolition of slavery. And then added to that, you had changes in England and its colonies like Canada, laws related to women having property, the suffrage movements, first wave feminism. So there's tons of social change going on. And when there is this kind of change, there's bound to be some kind of flux. And some elements were able to adapt, and that which had a goes without saying status before, or couldn't or wouldn't adapt, tended to lose its prestige, which opened up for new religions and practices to come in and address all these ideas. So we have new religions, new models for gender roles, new ways of looking at the world. And in this environment, these new practices and ideas have the ability to shift from being occult, going against the mainstream, or esoteric, somehow conforming to or adding to the storehouse of knowledge or offering a different alternative to it, and push ideas into what, for all intents and purposes, are accepted. In other words, these ideas require a sort of Archimedean tipping point where the general consensus of a group or people interested in classifying a group collectively decide what gets to be occult, esoteric, what have you, depending on the preference, the agenda, or a whole variety of other circumstances. Because as I alluded to before, the occult or esoteric or any of these other related terms do not exist in the wild. They cannot be found sui generis and simply cataloged by interesting parties. It takes a lot of work for these classifications to make any sense. They simply just don't exist to be called out. And I think this brings me to the final point I've been awkwardly grappling towards with this presentation, and is that this change that has happened from about a year or so ago. Well, for me, these ideas, terms occult, esoteric, have been, if used correctly, pretty good at describing the world around us, especially from an academic perspective. Many of the phenomenon of the occult seem to make sense. When I first came up with this paper topic, I had a pretty good idea of what I want to talk about. But obviously, we've been in this throes of some serious social flux. So I wonder if the terms that we have are actually applicable today. Or is it time to come up with better ideas or better ways of thinking about these things, especially given the radical changes that have been going on? As I said last year around this time, I would think about what constitutes occult or esoteric would have been much more easily defined, or at least parsed out, than it happens to be today. And I don't think it's just me who are having these kinds of issues. One only has to turn on the news to see how the terms we, or at least the value or implications of the language that we use, is not really up to the task of accounting for some of the things that are going on in the world, these sort of extraordinary things that in the past might be called occult in the negative sense. For example, many news outlets, talking heads, pundits, and academics are grappling with the labels when talking about a variety of current issues. One of the ones that comes up is the issue of vaccines. This is one of the most powerful technologies invented by humankind. How, mind you now, is somehow in some circles part of a grand conspiracy to cause sickness or carry microchips, or part of some government cover-up. Now, of course, these ideas are not new. In the past, these would have been delegated to the fringes of the internet, or something you had to convince your parents was simply not true because they actually overheard it somewhere, on somebody on the street. It was sort of seen as fringe, it was seen as kind of scary. But now this idea has become more common that, if not reaching this tipping point in acceptance, nonetheless has become mainstream enough that people don't refer to it as crazy or lunacy anymore, but we call it vaccine hesitance, which strikes me as an incredibly interesting way of classifying this, like it's reasonable in some way. It seems that the occult negative classification of the anti-vax movement is now somehow becoming more esoteric. It's hesitant, right? It has a slightly better shine to it. Of course, another phenomenon, one that it's hard to ignore, is this idea of QAnon. I remember when QAnon, the global conspiracy theory that claims to be leading a charge against a satanic, pedophilic, and cannibalistic syndicate, became more than just a fringe ideology and became something that the previous president of the US seemed to grant tacit approval to. QAnon, which for all intents and purposes should be dismissed as kind of a little out there, nonetheless has a place in the US House of Representatives in Marjorie Taylor Greene. And while this is only a representative that is from one specific part of Georgia, how do we account for the 74 million voters that supported Trump? Of course, not all of these people supported him because of this sort of connection with something like QAnon. That would be a terrible overgeneralization. But nonetheless, the idea of QAnon and his link to it was not problematic enough for them to not vote for him. In my mind, if somebody was making those claims, if I agree with 90% of them, but that was the part that they adhered to, I would have trouble with that. So the idea of QAnon and what it claims, not that people accept it or believe it, but it's all of a sudden less than fringy. And that strikes me as something quite interesting. And of course, this is not something limited to the United States. In Canada, we are clearly not immune to these ideas. Vaccine hesitancy, especially in Alberta, is far from fringe. I don't know how many times I've heard, well, I live right near the legislature, so I get all the protests and I hear them all the time. And you would be surprised the amount of people that show up to those. Also, the Canadian QAnon Face group boasts more than 100,000 members. And researchers have also pointed out that the Canadian QAnon group, especially in Quebec, has been sort of a vector for this idea going to more French-centric parts of the world. So it is not simply limited to the US, Canada, or the Anglo world. It is starting to spread outside of this little context. So again, this idea is evolving. So then the question is, how do we describe things like vaccine hesitancy or QAnon? Is this now a new esoteric movement? Is it a cult? Or is it something else? Do we need new terms, new ideas to account for these kinds of phenomena? Because how researchers are struggling with this stuff, how we are trying to deal with it, is actually, I think, perpetuating a lot of these ideas in some way, shape, or form. Now, here is an example from an article called Tracking QAnon, How Trump Turned Conspiracy Theory Research Upside Down. And we see the old binary going on again. We have good and bad, fringe and mainstream, occult and esoteric. But these terms are not adequate, I think, to describe the popularity of some of these kinds of movements. To simply dismiss something as fringe doesn't mean you take it seriously and doesn't help you account for what's going on with it. So again, to quote the article at length, they go on to say, the broad narrative of QAnon is that the world is controlled by a satanic cabal of Satan-worshiping pedophiles. Travis View, co-host of the podcast QAnon Anonymous, told an interviewer in Nightline. And this cabal, they control everything. This includes the media and entertainment, politicians. QAnon followers believe that this cabal wouldn't continue ruling the world indefinitely were it not for the election of Donald Trump. The amorphous belief system has generated a wide spectrum of fictional and ludicrous beliefs based on deciphering cryptic messages believed without any evidence to be released online by figures, including denigration of folks like Hillary Clinton to Chrissy Teigen, have been imagined to be the center of this expansively sinister plot. Major events from the 2017 Las Vegas shooting to the Mueller investigation to the pandemic have been assimilated into an increasingly sprawling theory, often as soon as they occur. Elements of the anti-vaccination beliefs, COVID-19 misinformation, anti-Semitic tropes, and more have also been recruited into the roster of belief, inflating QAnon into a catch-all conspiracy theory. Q kind of encourages followers to basically believe whatever sounds most appealing to them, regardless of how deranged it sounds. As a consequence, they run off in these wild directions. Now, I'm not really all that interested in the content of QAnon. I mean, trying to nail down QAnon is like trying to nail Jello to a wall. Like, it's really hard to suss it together. It tends to take on a chimeric almost shape. So I'm not really interested in that, or the ideology, or whether it fed into the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. We could spend all day trying to debunk these things. And discussing that they don't make sense. And it wouldn't even be like shooting a fish in a barrel. In a lot of these things, it'd be more like hunting cattle with a bazooka. This isn't going to be a problem, right? The factual claims of them aren't really at stake. What I'm more interested in is the way the article writer, Tolferson, as an example of a wider problem I see within academia and folks trying to come up with these way to describe this phenomena, are trying to classify things like QAnon, anti-vaxxers, Pizzagate. The attempts to frame it seems very much in line with how we used to talk about occult in a negative term. And again, he uses terms like amorphous belief without any evidence, deranged, all these kinds of ideas. And again, these ideas are wild. I mean, there's no question that we are talking about some pretty interesting stuff here, but that's not the point. The point to me anyway is that in trying to talk about these ideas in any kind of productive way, using these negative signifiers, these sort of old catch-alls like amorphous, deranged, what have you, isn't really helping us understand what is going on. It isn't really about the truth claims at all. It's not hard to take the fact value of most truth claims with a huge grain of salt. I teach in a religious studies department. I've told students that if it was limited to the facts, I'd have nothing to talk about. So again, from a certain perspective, whether it's true or not is really not all that relevant. But what I'm interested in is, given the popularity of these sort of ideas, can we talk about them in the same kind of way that we would talk about the occult in a negative? Or have we reached that weird tipping point where things like vaccine hesitancy, satanic cabals are becoming, if not institutionalized storehouses of knowledge, or at least becoming more commonsensical? So it does make me wonder, are we needing to come up with a better way to describe these things? So again, much like that disastrous first date that I went on, what is a cult or not, what is fact or fringe, is really about the person making these claims. And it is an interesting point of history to watch this shift as it does now. Thank you. I don't know how to unmute everybody. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So we do have a little bit of time for questions.
I'm sorry, it took way longer than I thought I was going to be. My apologies.
Not a problem. Well, we also got a bit of a late start because of some technological issues. So if people want to put their questions in the chat or use the hand raise feature, we'll sort of keep some semblance of order.
I hope somebody's moderating this. I have no idea how to even answer, how to deal with it.
I hope someone is too. That's probably His Eminence. It's not me.
Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, so you, in talking about how essentially our perception of something can change our idea around it, I watched a Religion for Breakfast video where he talked about the Shinto religion.
Yes.
And how there is, how beforehand they didn't really have this concept of religion, or Shinto wasn't quite viewed as religion there, and it was more so like put on by being reintegrated into the world. And I was wondering if, in your opinion, do you think that this idea of religion like influenced the way that they viewed the emperor as God in a way?
Yeah, like Shinto's a great example of how the idea of religion doesn't fit on a lot of things. Usually when we think about religion, at least in the modern context, it's very Protestant in a lot of ways. It is about belief. It is about, your interior stance to something. It is text, these kinds of things. Where Shinto is a religion, it doesn't really map on that. And I think a lot of people focused on the idea that the emperor was a God figure because that was familiar. But Shinto encapsulates so much other things that tend to get underplayed. I'm not an expert on Shinto, but yeah, the way it kind of mapped onto the model was certainly interesting. Like one of the there's the memorial I believe it's in Tokyo, to the folks who died in World War II serving the emperor. A lot of them are war criminals, according to the perspective of the victors. But but to the people in Japan, or the folks interested in that, that's not the point. The point is that they died for this object. So, Westerners have misunderstood the worshiping of these war criminals, where in fact it was something very different. So yeah, the religion is one of the more famous scholars in religious studies, Jonathan Z. Smith, said, it's not that we can't define religion, it's just that we can define it 50 different ways. And I think Shinto's a great example of that, for sure.
Okay.
I've tried, I've been studying this stuff for about a decade, and I can't figure out what it is. I have no idea. So,
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Jason Memo had a question, but before we get to that, I was actually curious. You talked about earlier on. You talked about the shifting perspective on shamanism, and I'm wondering where you see the exact kind of turning point. I was listening to, thanks to a recommendation from a parishioner, I was listening to a current podcast that just came out that's kind of exploring the whole history around the associated mystery and fakery around Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan, that type of stuff. So right. I'm wondering, and you had kind of mentioned that it kind of referenced around, the 50s. So I was thinking, yeah, that's kind of 50s, 60s is roughly that era. So if, I guess what would have been the kind of hinge points that shifted the perspective on shamanism from a public point of view?
Sure. I mean, one of the funny things I noticed is the textbooks, they changed. All of a sudden, shamanism became its own section, and it became a world religion. And I think it was this idea of that we can't just be based around these Christian-centric models where you have Christianity is the real religion and Judaism gets a pass because, it's kind of like us. And then Islam, yeah, there's a lot of them, so we'll throw that in. There's sort of understanding that there's more going on. And I think the cultural awareness that these people had beliefs that perhaps could be considered religious. I grew up in a little small town in Ontario called Orillia. And there's a monument at the beach, or there used to be, where it had a statue of a Jesuit priest holding a cross with these indigenous folks sort of cowering at his feet. And it said, the Europeans came and brought them laws and religion, right? The statue was up for about 100 years. Well, it's removed now because it's racist, but also our ideas of what can be seen as religion have sort of changed. And because of the political realities that recognizing that people of color have valid beliefs. Like it's sort of this odd sort of connection between, I think, social realities and religious realities. A similar example comes to mind is early Christianity. Up until World War II, it was seen as anti-Jewish. Now, post-Holocaust, seeing that that kind of intellectual environment contributed to things like the Holocaust, early Christianity is seen as super Jewish in some way. And if you make an opposite claim, you get a lot of grief for that. So I think, again, how things get moved around really depends on sort of the tenor in the air. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That does the trick. Jason, go ahead.
That was phenomenal to hear. And one of the things that it got me thinking of, particularly as you were getting into the QAnon stuff, about the like that it's like trying to pin Jello to a wall. What really struck me is that, like, it's in a way the overabundance of detail in that kind of like private occultness and its ability to be perceived and ability of perception is overabundance of detail. And I guess my question is that, like, is that detail, or is that level of detail something that we see a lot in a lot of what is generally considered occult?
Some of the question broke up a little bit there, so forgive me if I miss some of what you said. I think it's funny. It's so. Could you reframe the question? I think I may have lost my train of thought there.
No, for sure. Yeah.
Breaking looking at the table, you
know. Looking at the idea of if the occult, like if QAnon is occult in the sense that it's hard to be perceived, and part of that difficulty is based on the overabundance of continual detail.
Right.
How much is an abundance of detail a part of an occult? Like, is that another thing that you can say as a correlation between many occult practices?
I think so. I mean, the more detail something has, the more robust of a system it is, the more convincing it is, right? I mean, one of the funny things with QAnon is that it's a conspiracy without a theory. It gets to throw everything into it to tie it in. Where, before we'd have, Freemasons run the world. Well, then you'd have like the conspiracy and the theory behind it. Now we actually just have a conspiracy with no sort of idea about it. So in a sense, the detail makes it more convincing, but also makes it really hard to describe. I have an old grad student that I taught years ago that she's doing work on QAnon and the Satanic Temple, and she's like, she just can't keep up. Like every day something new is added to that, so that the detail in a sense grants legitimacy to the people who adhere to it, but also makes it so hard to try to talk about. Oh, there's a cat on the screen. Sorry, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
I'm sorry?
I am not a cat.
I want to figure out that meme so I can do that to next interviews.
Any more questions? No? Well, thank you kindly. That was enjoyable.
Thank you, guys.
And it's also, I figured that, this would, as we live in the same province, so you live in an inferior portion of the province, I have to, there's a little bit of Calgary, Edmonton thing going on. I mean, now I don't even think it's real. I think we just do it as a matter of ritual.
It is.
I lived in Edmonton when I was very, very young. I had no say in the matter. We could talk about the shifting definition of child abuse and whether that fits. No, I like Edmonton, actually. It's got some really good restaurants. It's a nice place to visit. So I was hoping, that we would have the opportunity to do this all in person, as you're only about 3 hours away, but the world had different ideas. So thank you just the same for allowing us the rain check and
Thank you, guys.
taking us on a tour, as it were.
Oh,
Thank you very kindly.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. And
you.
for everybody else, we will catch you in 19 minutes-ish.